standardization is one of the biggest productivity boons to anything, right? You're talking about like, in finance, there's all these complex systems. Everyone talks about cross-border payments, how like the banking rails in every country are different and it's very hard to sort of move money around. Well, that's just because, there's very little standardization. And think about like I used to do when I was an academic international trade. And one of the biggest sort of productivity boons to international trade was the creation of, or the invention of the container. And it's kind of like, it's just a metal box, right? Like it's not like someone created, electricity or antibiotics. It's literally a metal box. But that was enormous because it meant that people no longer have to have like these complex ships. And I think that's a little bit of what interoperability does. And while I think that a lot of people are, and I hope they don't hate me for this, but I think a lot of people are just like decentralization maxis for the purpose of decentralization, which is a fair position to take. I think that really the reason why decentralization is valuable in this case is because in order to truly harness interoperability, you need some degree of decentralization, or else like the centralized party can always just say like, I don't like you anymore, move. And then at that point, you're Mexico, you're integrated with the global rails, but then that centralized party says like, I don't like you anymore. It breeds fragmentation. So interoperability, I think, is what we're talking about with standardization, about making these rails being able to talk to each other very simple. And decentralization is what really delivers teeth. It's what delivers value and makes it possible.
Alonso, thank you so much for joining me. Excited to find out another person is expanding the Miami crypto ecosystem, but thank you for coming on the podcast. Really looking forward to doing this and diving into really a lot of the inner workings at Mysten and what you have been up to at Sui.
It's my pleasure. Logan, thank you so much for the invitation, and a pleasure to talk to you and reach your audience and talk about Sui.
Awesome. Well, maybe to kick it off, let's start with a little bit of your background, how you ended up at Mysten, and really diving deep into the tokenomics.
Yeah, sure. So, taking maybe a little bit of a step back, like many years ago, I was very much sort of on this sort of economist academic path towards, doing a PhD, being a professor, publishing, all that kind of stuff. I was pretty into it until at some point I realized that I was kind of bored, and also that I wanted to do things that were a little bit more tangible. I feel like when you're in academia, especially in economics and the social sciences, you're very much like observing the world and trying to explain it, as opposed to like acting upon the world and trying to do things. So I had a little bit, something in me that said like, let's do something more interesting. And so at that point I moved to Facebook. That was the initial phases of the Libra project that was later called DM. And I spent a few years there at Facebook, and it was really interesting to see sort of just generally how, these giant tech companies work, but also more interestingly, that's where I started getting my feet wet a little bit more with the crypto stuff. I was already interested as a sort of enthusiast in crypto when I was an academic, but like this was the first opportunity I actually was able to do something myself. Spent a lot of years there working on the Libra stablecoin, on the design of the stablecoin, on sort of the use cases of the stablecoin, especially in terms of financial inclusion. And that's where I met all the founders of Mysten Labs, and we worked together. And so when they went out to create Mysten Labs, I believe it was in late 2021, it was kind of very natural for me to come with them, because I was like, I know you guys, you're great, your project is great, let's figure out what we can build. And so I've been in here at Mysten Labs since then. And obviously the big first project of Mysten has been Sui, but there's sort of more interesting things to come. It's really a startup that is interested in redefining how the infrastructure of the internet works. One of that is sort of Sui as the coordination layer for intelligent digital assets, but it's really the first step. And so that's how I got here. And, since then I've been working on the tokenomics on Sui, trying to make it an ecosystem that can be sustainable from a business perspective, and trying to grow, in particular from a product perspective, the financial services ecosystem on Sui, DeFi, but also more generally.
Amazing. Well, I appreciate all the background context. I think maybe starting off with the tokenomics would be interesting, because if we kind of look at the history of blockchain and the designs and ultimately how we got here, it's very fascinating to me, because I think if you look at kind of Web 2, it's really about abundance, kind of the proliferation that ultimately you can scale these systems. And the early blockchain designs were really about scarcity, keeping block space small, not really having abundance. and then they kind of went to Turing completeness, but still were really kind of in the middle ground, in my point of view, trying to balance scarcity, but also trying to balance abundance. And I think now where I'm super excited is we're getting to the point where we have these high throughput blockchains that are uniquely focused on just scale and applications that can be built on top of them. But with that, and kind of the lack of scarcity ultimately comes in, how do you design these tokenomic incentives to actually work at scale, and where those kind of take us long term? So I'd love to dive deeper into some of your thoughts, how you're thinking about it, and kind of maybe talking about pre-scale, and then also like once we hit scale, how do those economics also change?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great little narrative of how blockchains have evolved in the last 10 to 15 years. So going back to this point of thinking about Sui as infrastructure for the internet that can truly be like the infra that handles like all of digital assets. To give you a sort of Web 2 analog, I think about the way we build Sui from a tokenomics perspective. It's a little like cloud computing. So back in the day, everyone had to run their own server if you wanted to have an app. Then AWS and Google Cloud and Microsoft Azure and these guys started creating sort of these servers that you can just run on demand. And one of the nice things they have is that they have a lot of elastic capacity, right? If suddenly your startup has 10x the amount of traffic or 100 times the amount of traffic, you're not sitting there where, oh my God, my server is going to be congested. Like that problem has been solved, right? Like, you buy one, you rent one server. If you have 10x traffic, you rent 10 servers, you pay 10 times as twice. It scales linearly. It all works very nicely. And I think from Sui, we sort of had that design goal from the beginning. From an engineering point of view, Sui was created from basically first principles, thinking like, what is the architecture from an engineer perspective that can sustain, hundreds of millions of digital assets, billions of users. So Sui has, from an architectural point of view, this sort of object-centric model that enables, together with his consensus mechanism, sort of basically infinite parallelization. And the idea is very simple. Everything on Sui is an object. It doesn't matter if it's a fungible token, a non-fungible token, a smart contract, whatever, everything's an object. And if two objects don't have dependencies, then they can basically be executed in parallel, and that can scale infinitely. That's very different from sort of the old blockchains, in which I think it was very much a proof of concept of how can you build permissionless distributed systems. And if you go to like the very, original ones that have been very successful, like in Ethereum, like there's no sense in which things can be parallelized, right? Like in Ethereum, in a block, literally everything is ordered relative to each other. And because the blocks are chained, it's a blockchain, everything in a blockchain is ordered relative to each other. That doesn't need to happen on Sui. And so for removing those type of constraints, it was really give you the powerful to scale, kind of in the way of like cloud computing. Now, if you have an app on Sui that has one day 10x the traffic or 100x the traffic, well, then you can have 10x or 100x the objects. They can be executed in parallel. You shouldn't have those concerns in terms of, a lack of throughput. Now, the interesting part is that's from an engineering perspective, and, engineering can be very solid, but because crypto has a sort of permissionless nature in which you need a token and you need certain financial incentives to get the different entities to work together, the operators, the validators, the token holders, the users, etc. You need the tokenomics to work hand in hand. And so Sui's basic contribution to that from a tokenomics perspective was created a financial layer of incentives that work hand in hand with the engineering. And basically the idea is very simple. Gas in Sui works in a way in which the validators sort of get together and figure out like, what is the gas price that makes us break even? And when, there's more traffic, validators add more computers. So if there's 10x the traffic, they'll add 10x the computers. Their costs are scaling linearly, but because there's 10x traffic, their revenue is also scaling linearly. And so at a given gas price, the chain can be pretty much, from a cost efficiency perspective, just as efficient, regardless of the amount of demand there is. That's what sort of lets you have a really scalable system that doesn't sort of deliver these surge pricing problems that you have in other chains, in which like there just simply is no more space, so you need to jack up the prices in order to create that.
I think that's a super important point, because It's kind of funny because, as you pointed out, going back in history,
Yeah,
everybody did have these giant server racks in their closet or garage, and we're
right.
trying to scale these systems. And I think we've been butting up against those limitations today, which to me was always one of the most frustrating things for the application engineers, because you start to achieve some level of product market fit, whether
Right.
it's you or another application, starts to create this noisy neighbor problem where now your application is just not usable. And so really excited that Sui has focused on that from day one, because I think we're kind of transitioning from this feature in the past being a nice to have just because blockchains really didn't have the level of scale required. But now going forward, as more and more people try to experiment, do things like order books, these are really going to be a necessity.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think what Sui tries to achieve, and again, even in Sui, we're very in the early stages, and there's other chains that are trying to do similar things. It's very much like remove the complexity of all the underlying infra problems from the app developer, so that the app developer can truly focus on what they do best, which is, as you said, finding product market fit. So that is very much, I think, in the ethos of what we're trying to do here.
And how does kind of that engineering kind of focus ultimately translate to the economics of the token? Because I think some of these other networks, perhaps using Solana as example, being one of the first high throughput blockchains, it was really fudded for the lack of scarcity, at least initially, because in my mind, there's kind of a couple key drivers, and feel free to push back on any of these, whether it's like MEV, priority fees, just overall network usage, and just increasing transaction kind of throughput. And in the beginning of of all high throughput networks, because there's not a lot of scarcity, because the goal of the network is really the opposite, the abundance. These networks look a little bit funky because generally they have higher inflation rewards to get validators up online, reward them.
Yep.
How are you guys thinking about kind of either kind of pre-critical mass and then post-critical mass with either MEV, priority fees, getting people essentially, whether it's validators or internal applications, to capture some of that value?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I think, when you think about from like what is the critical mass necessary to become cost efficient, it goes back to this idea that validators have a certain hardware, a certain cost structure that they need to uphold. And once they're able to be sustainable from a revenue perspective with that, then the chain itself is sustainable because the operators are working well. And so really is like right now, the validators have the most basic machine configuration. And today they're still not at capacity. So that is, I think, the sort of funky period that you're talking about, right? Right now, I do need to have my basic spec, and that gives me a cost. How much revenue am I making? Is it enough revenue in order to cover it? But once you're there, whether you have like that or you need to have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 100 machines, you're just as sustainable because you're just adding machines as you're seeing more traffic coming into the network. So I think like we're not too far away from being from that point, because you really just need to get that. The validators have the gas price such that they break even. It's just like you have a little bit of slack because we're still very early in terms of these chains. So I think like that question has been addressed by the gas mechanics in terms of sort of what I think people ask. How does the token accrue value, right? And these kind of questions when you don't have like that more artificial scarcity. I think one thing that we did in Sui was, and this comes from, I think, from like a little bit of sort of the economics background is, you always see people talking about the Federal Reserve. Are they going to lower rates? Are they going to increase rates? And all this questions comes really because, at least in modern economies, in places like the United States, the Fed has a mandate of 2% inflation, right? Like, and the whole question about, whether they're going to raise rates or not is because do we believe the Fed is going to, honor that 2% target? So I think in Sui, because we know that having those type of nominal anchors are very hard to sustain, we sort of just did something very simple, which is let's get rid of the problem and have a finite supply of Sui tokens, which is another way of saying like we just have zero inflation. And so the monetary rule is very clear for everyone, right? Like what leads to price dynamics is a combination of supply and demand. And if you fix supply, then everything needs to be driven by demand. And so in Sui, if you look at sort of on-chain prices in terms of the Sui token, the only thing that matters is how much demand there is. And that if there is increasingly demand that is growing over time, that growth, because supply is fixed, is going to lead to deflation. And it's pretty much that simple. So it does very much hinge on the fact that you need to grow over time. But like ultimately, Sui is a blockchain that is built to, handle all of digital assets on the internet. So like we're all about growth, and that is what delivers those deflationary mechanics, or we hope will in the long run.
How would you address maybe concerns from the economic side if someone said, look, if you don't have a small amount of inflation in your token or even money supply as the United States does, people will want to hoard their cash because inevitably it will increase in value and it will kind of stop people from facilitating trade?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it really depends on what is the unit of account that people use. I think today, as much as like us in the crypto community like to talk about, full decentralization, including monetary systems, and this is a personally held belief, I think we will never move to a world in which like fiat ceases to be of relevance, and people will still, like in the United States, anchor on the dollar, and in Mexico on the Mexican peso, in Europe in the euro, whatever. So really, like these tokens are a little bit more of a medium of exchange that's particularly relevant to an ecosystem which they have a lot of things to do. And so for me, those things about like cash flowing is not so relevant because you can always buy sweet tokens on demand. If there are particular people that are interested in holding those tokens because they feel like the network is going to keep growing and want to have a sort of financial interest in it, that's great for them. I think for the majority of people, all these things are going to be hidden under the hood. And what they will experience is that gas fees will fall in terms of the token, so there will be deflation. But they don't really care because from a financial perspective, from a portfolio perspective, this is a very small amount. It's almost like just a medium of exchange, whatever, it doesn't matter. I think that's for Sui. For the older blockchains like Bitcoin and perhaps Ethereum, I think the story is a little bit different.
Makes sense. Maybe shifting slightly, I think all the networks from the high throughput days will hopefully eventually get to a critical mass where that validator set is kind of self-sufficient, as we've been talking about. But even in these earlier networks, one hot topic has really been about MEV, or maximal extractive value. How do you think about the maximal extractive value within Sui?
Yeah, so I think MEV is actually I think sometimes it's it's definitely a very popular topic, but it's very nuanced and it's very hard to understand exactly, what drives what and what is sort of the aggregate effect. Needless to say, for a new network with Sui, MEV is very contingent on how the operations of the network work. And so there are some interesting teams that are trying to figure out how to, I wouldn't say like extract MEV, but sort of channel MEV to good causes. The key question for me is not so much whether MEV exists or not. Like in some cases, like for sandwich attacks and like front running, like you're always going to have that at some level. The question is whether when there is sort of an extraction of MEV, whether it can be channeled into things that are aligned with the network's best interest. So in some cases, and this is a little bit, going back to, I don't want to be too academic, but to like the public finance literature in economics, is when you think about taxation, what taxation should be? Should it be for, government expenditure? Should it be given back to the citizens? Should it be, given to the military, whatever? It's kind of like the same thing with MEV. Should you be rewarding the operators, the validators? Should you figure a way of like, sure, making that MEV does accrue to someone, but distributing it more generally across the ecosystem, across all participants? And so I think like what some teams are doing is they're thinking about like, is there a way of doing that MEV extraction, but in a way that ultimately then is delivered not to some specific participants, but more generally to the ecosystem. And while the validators in other ecosystems have been very, gained a financial edge through this, perhaps here in Sui, they just become just more standard operators who are very much like, standard, internet infrastructure providers. They have a good business, but they don't have to make like, this financial killing in the sense of like a combination between a hedge fund and an infrastructure operator.
I think that makes sense. You should be compensated for the service you provide, but you don't have to be overly compensated. I think kind of diving deeper into some of the nuances, the crypto community, at least today, seems a little bit torn about where MEV should ultimately be settled, or where that value should accrue. And if you spend too much time on crypto Twitter like I do, you'll hear the modular enthusiasts say, hey, you need to ultimately create your own L2, you need to create your own app chain, because if you don't, you'll leak value to the underlying blockchain. And then there's another school of camp, kind of, in my opinion, the high throughput integrated chains that I think are figuring out ways to have value be captured more at the application layer. How much thought has kind of the SWE or Mysten Labs team kind of put into this debate? Are you guys at the point where you're thinking about some of this stuff? And if so, what are your kind of thoughts around it?
Yeah, I think that's a very good way of sort of putting how the discussion, like there's two camps on Twitter. I also spend too much on crypto Twitter myself, so definitely guilty on that regard. I would say, like, personally, we would be much more proponent of the second camp. I think we believe, and maybe this is a good moment to talk about the Move programming language. So SWE, the smart contract scripting language is called Move. It was created for Libra back in the day. Basically, it's just a very friendly way of developing that, doesn't have a lot of the, re-entrancy and other types of risk attacks that, something like Solidity would have. And the reason, and I'm going to go through a little bit of a tangent, but you'll see why. The reason I think Move is very powerful is because, by being much more accessible and not requiring that, you're a total blockchain junkie or, you don't have a computer science PhD or anything like that, it really opens the floodgates for people in random places of the world to develop product, right? Like you can be in Central America and maybe you don't know much about computers, but you have a lot of pain points because you see your family, maybe they don't have access to bank accounts, or maybe, you're in East Asia and you like to play a lot of video games and, the traditional video game or gaming companies don't enable you to do certain things. So what Move lets you do is let you prototype these projects in a blockchain environment in a very friendly and easy way. I think that's very important, because it's going to create a wave of product innovation that would be very hard to do in other places like Ethereum, where, every time someone creates a new DEX or whatever, 95% of the code is recycled from Uniswap or whomever, because it's just very risky to implement something new that has a big attack vector. The design surface is very, very limited. And so this product innovation is really relevant because it means we're also going to get innovation in new business models. And I think we will sort of move away from this very narrow crypto conversation of like, how do you extract value from the chain, layer twos, blah, 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 to more in which people like, I just want to create an app that needs an interoperable network to be more valuable than if I hosted it on AWS. Can you give me that solution? And I will figure out my monetization elsewhere. We're not there yet, but I think that's where we would like to go. And if we are able, I'm not talking about just SWE, just generally as an industry, to deliver on that, I think finally we can go to people who are very crypto skeptic and say like, oh, this actually has value. Look at all these cool products that are on crypto.
100%. And I am very aligned with that vision. I think I've personally been a little bit frustrated. And why I've been so excited about the high throughput blockchains more broadly is exactly to that point. You in-house the complexities so that application engineers can focus on applications and worry about finding product market fit than trying to spin up their own infrastructure and get your computer science degree and all that mumbo jumbo that comes along with that. So no, I'm very much aligned with that. Maybe moving on slightly, I think SWE has done a good job about fostering and starting to build that organic ecosystem. I always say, as a new kind of community is building, you always have to build the basic building blocks. You kind of need your borrow land, an AMM, an order book, NFT platform. All those necessities are really required for the crypto community to really start experimenting. And I think SWE is definitely on its way in building out that organic community. But how would you kind of assess SWE's broader kind of adoption with DeFi? How are you seeing that progressing, being on the ground floor?
Yeah, so I think DeFi has been a little bit of a boon to SWE. It grew from almost zero in the last 8 months to SWE reached almost $1 billion in TVL. It's gone down a little bit with a little more later market crash. I think more interesting than TVL, volume has been pretty strong. And within that ecosystem, the foundation and Mysten and just the broader developer community have been able to create like very strong protocols that I think today, for the most part, are a little bit traditional in the sense like, you have your AMM, you have your more traditional concentrated liquidity AMM, you have your more traditional lending protocol, and all these kind of things. Perhaps the perp stacks are a little bit more on the frontier, but it's really sort of building up those built-in blocks, which are the foundation, hoping that you have a very strong developer community that in the very near future will be able to leverage the fact that the basic building blocks exist, but also they're more inherent knowledge about both how Sui's architecture works, but the Move programming language and all these things to build those killer DeFi apps on Sui in the same way like Uniswap was huge on Ethereum, 3 or 4 years ago. More recently, like Jito or Jupiter on Solana have been. Like, what are those type of products that are going to be very strong on Sui? We don't have them today. I want to be very open about that. But very much all these efforts are about giving those developers and trying to sort of increase the number of shots on goal that we have so that they end up developing that killer use case. I don't think the end goal is at all to say like, Sui has the biggest AMM, which is basically a copy of Uniswap v3 and has like the most amount of volume. Like, that's not a bad thing. Don't get me wrong. I would love for that to happen. And like, we're very, very far away from even that happening. But I think like the true victory would be at a moment in which those devs go and look at the chain and say like, we built something that is tailor-made to Sui. We use Sui's strengths and we really delivered something that's not possible elsewhere. And it's very hard to forecast what that's going to be because I just don't think you can forecast innovations, but you can sort of increase the probability that materializes by having more developers experiment. And that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I've always been fascinated by once you 1000x the capacity, what type of applications can engineers build that they couldn't build on the low throughput chains? And I think we're just now starting to experiment that on these other chains, and like including Sui also enables this massive experimentation. And I think part of that is order books. When you have 12 transactions per second, it's very hard to set bids and ask and update that order book with such limited throughput. Can you talk about what Sui and Mysten Labs is ultimately building with DeepBook?
Yeah. So I think DeepBook is the goal of DeepBook is very much to be sort of a community project that is sort of, just how we're building different infrastructure layers for the internet. I think the same is true for financial services. And so obviously Sui is at the bottom, it's the true infrastructure layer for the digital assets that run on Sui. Then there's a wholesale liquidity layer. That's what DeepBook is supposed to be. It's supposed to be the deepest and tightest liquidity for, especially I would say like tier one assets. For more tail assets, probably DeepBook will not be the solution. And then on top of that, you will have the DeFi protocols that will source liquidity from DeepBook in order to offer richer financial services to end users. And so in order to have that type of world, an order book in some ways is much better than an AMM. It gives market makers a lot more control over price. You can have a lot more depth. But it has other things, maybe it's less composable. It's definitely much harder to build, as you were saying. Every time someone wants to sort of post a limit order, they want to move the price, they want to move the bid, the tick size, all these kind of things. It's very costly if you're not able to sort of be doing that all the time, right? An AMM is kind of like passive. You just put some money in, you see what it has. You don't have a lot of control. Granted, like market makers do need to be smart about how they hedge certain things because the permanent loss is very big. But in terms of like the active liquidity management, it's a little bit less stringent than what an order book has. And so what DeepBook has is it really sort of leverages Sui's ability of having not only the throughput but the latency. And so DeepBook is 100% on chain. The routing of the orders, the matching of the orders, settlement of the orders, everything happens on chain. It gives market makers a very efficient perspective for providing liquidity. Market makers can have a pool in which they provide their funds and they can use it to market make across different books. It's built in a way that the APIs provide a AMM-like experience, so to speak, so that the DeFi protocols can plug in and source that liquidity in a way that's friendly to them and not complex. And so those are very much the goals about being that wholesale liquidity layer that sort of is the grease that makes the wheels of the whole financial services ecosystem on Sui move.
Yeah, and it's, again, super helpful that this is all integrated. There's kind of one source of liquidity that people can tap into. It's very
Yep.
helpful than having 100 different layer twos or layer threes that kind of fragment that liquidity and make it harder to make markets across each of those.
Yep, that's right. And I think one thing, sorry, I didn't mention, which is perhaps the most important thing about DeepBook, is that the team that has been building DeepBook also, as in the case of Sui, where the engineering is very strong and it has a very tailor-made incentives layer on top. The same thing is for DeepBook. There are very clear incentives for market makers to provide liquidity. There's like this very interesting sort of counter-cyclical valve in which when liquidity is low, market makers get more rebates than when liquidity is high. And that ensures that when the liquidity is low, there's more liquidity. And when liquidity is very high, you're kind of good. You don't need to encourage more folks to come in. For takers, the more volume they take or they execute, they get sort of a lower fee schedule. And so it's kind of like, you get a bulk discount after a certain amount. And so it has a lot of moving parts. It has some governance components that really make DeepBook say, like, it's not only that the engineering is strong, but for the different participants, it aligns their interests, kind of hoping that DeepBook not only is infrastructure that can enable this, but actually the incentives deliver that outcome.
No, it's very unique. The saying is, show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome. I very much appreciate the incentives to add additional liquidity. One thing we are seeing, though, in the Ethereum and now starting to in the Solana ecosystem, as well as kind of this private order flow. And I think I read an article this past week on Ethereum having up to like 50% of the transactions actually going through private order flow. And I think that's interesting in the sense that when these kind of market making competition actually heats up, market makers obviously want to be profitable over time. Mm-hmm. If they can have better flows or have private flows, then potentially they could quote tighter spreads, be able to give retail or whoever essentially passing on those savings, but also know that they're going to be more profitable. Has we gotten, or Mysten Labs gotten to the point about thinking about some of these private order flows and just your thoughts around how market dynamics, maybe a better question is, obviously today it's early. In the end state of Sui, Mysten Labs, what do you foresee happening? Is it powering the entire world? Is all financial rails on Sui? Maybe painting that broad question is better than kind of private order flows.
Yeah, no. I think it's a really interesting question, and I'm going to like speculate a little bit. So,
Please
5
do.
years we come back to this conversation, you tell me I was wrong. It's just kind of
always
what
like
it
predictions.
is. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's interesting, right? Like on the Ethereum cave, that what you're referring to is a little bit a signal of, I would say, market maturity. In traditional finance, like, dark pools and all these things are very, very prevalent, but they have an impact on the sort of more open things because they also create their own arbitrage opportunities, and that should sort of have a first order effect on other trading venues. On the other side, you could also say it's a little bit of, it's unclear who are the winners. So while in its maturity, perhaps it's matured in the same way that TradFi has matured, which is not always friendly to everyone, or like especially the people that don't have like the gazillions in the bank. But anyways, in terms of sort of how we see Sui in the future, I think, I would love to say that I think Sui is sort of everything should move on chain and everything should be on Sui in the future. And if that does end up happening, I mean, that's great, right? Like, we're done. But I think more importantly, the opportunity is really to identify where there are strengths that do not exist in other types of technologies. And to me, like the most important ones when I think about not only about Sui, but just general about this whole industry, and that Sui, because it's at the forefront of the infra, can enable the most, is interoperability in global markets. So there's a lot of segmented markets out there in the world, which, still operate in a very sort of strange fashion. Like foreign exchange is one of them. Like, why is it people that are calling each other? Or like fixed income, it's just like some of the bonds are just so unique that it's very hard to have sort of more central markets. And so I think these are the things where there are some benefits in terms of like creating that interoperability and global layer. But there's even simpler things. I'm from Mexico, and you'd be surprised that even today in Mexico, if I want to buy sort of NVIDIA stock, like that's very, very hard to do. And I'm not talking about like some random asset, right? Like this is NVIDIA. It's something that everyone's very excited to. And so in the future, just literally having an open permissionless system in which people can have access to those type of tier one assets, that is sufficient probably for like 90% of what people want to do. Then there's a 10%, which like, let's be honest, that 10% might be the one that generates the most amount of fees or revenue, but it's a little bit more exotic that I think chains can also do. And so I think that the vision really is, how could this infrastructure be something that really leverages Sui's strengths of interoperability, of move programmability, which is very friendly to developers. And that is something you're already starting to see in Sui DeFi. Like one thing that I do think Sui DeFi protocols are doing different from other places is they're leveraging Sui's composability to offer very, for example, complex yield farming strategies at a one-click solution. So you have your wallet, one click, boom, 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 it does 20 different things in a thing called a programmable transaction block. And it's very seamless because Sui was sort of built in that way in order to make it very friendly. And so these are the types of use cases, and like you say, like that infrastructure as a coordination layer for digital assets is very powerful. You don't always need to go to the most exotic things. There's already some very simple things that if you're able to move the needle on, it's extremely powerful. But we're definitely, like, as you said, very early. Everyone says that. It is true. We need to deliver. And so in 5 years when, hopefully we've been able to deliver a little bit on it.
Yeah. I've always been fascinated by kind of the banks as they exist today as kind of like these heterogeneous databases that are slow, have super high latency, and sometimes not always the most secure. And to me, the really cool part about all these blockchains is the fact that you're essentially enabling permissionless interaction with them.
That's
and
right.
then by increasing the bandwidth, communication in between them, you're lowering the latency, and with private keys and even things like ZK login, ultimately able to make them more secure. And I think when you take those heterogeneous databases and kind of collapse them into one giant database, there's a lot of interesting things that can happen in the Forex markets, as you mentioned. I kind of even think of like stock markets as their individual databases, and TBD how all those pieces ultimately play out and come together. But there's a lot of interesting experiments in my mind on the DeFi side that could potentially be run, because now all these systems are really integrated. Everybody can opt in, have this same shared standards, which I think is powerful. And we're just now seeing the experimentation, but 5-10 years in the future, I'm very excited to see what interesting engineers build.
Yeah, 100%. And I think like one of the things that you were touching on is standardization is one of the biggest productivity boons to anything, right? You're talking about like, in finance, there's all these complex systems. Everyone talks about cross-border payments, how like the banking rails in every country are different, and it's very hard to sort of move money around. Well, that's just because, there's very little standardization. And think about like I used to do when I was an academic international trade. And one of the biggest sort of productivity boons to international trade was the creation of, or the invention of, the container. And it's kind of like, it's just a metal box, right? Like it's not like someone created, electricity or antibiotics. It's literally a metal box. But that was enormous because it meant that people no longer have to have like these complex ships in which every like little compartment is different. Every product is different. Bringing the things on and taking them out makes it very complex. Now it's very simple. All the ships are the same. All the containers are the same. You just load them and unload them. You can standardize ports. It was truly a boon. And I think that's a little bit of what interoperability does. And while I think that a lot of people are, I hope they don't hate me for this, but I think a lot of people are just like decentralization maxis for the purpose of decentralization, which is a fair position to take. I think that really the reason why decentralization is valuable in this case is because in order to truly harness interoperability, you need some degree of decentralization, or else like the centralized party can always just say like, I don't like you anymore, move. And then at that point, you're Mexico, you're integrated with the global rails, but then that centralized party says like, I don't like you anymore. It breeds fragmentation. So interoperability, I think, is what we're talking about with standardization, about making these rails being able to talk to each other very simple. And decentralization is what really delivers teeth. It's what delivers value and makes it possible. So yeah.
Censorship resistance is a must. Decentralization for the decentralization, I think, is a bit overkill. But that shared standards that everybody opts into is really
That's right.
the alpha, because everybody agrees. And just getting to that point is absolutely massive, going to your point with the containerization. And I think right now we're seeing some of these issues arise with L2s. Yes, it's not a intractable engineering problem. There could be a shared standard. Everybody just has to agree upon those standards, which where you have a high throughput integrated L1, then everybody by default, by using that network, opts into those standards, which I think is very eloquent.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think it's a bit, I mean, we were talking about like, what are the crazy use cases that you envision in the future? I still, personally believe that cross-border payment is something that could be huge if we ever manage to get it right. It was definitely one of the things that were behind the whole Libra project. It was always talked about like, remittances and these kind of things. And even here we are like 5 years later, some chains and some teams have been able to do a little bit. But I think it's a little bit, not to end with a negative note or anything, but it is a little bit concerning that, blockchain has been around for a while. Cross-border payments have been around forever, and we still haven't been able to move the needle as much as we'd want to. So it's not so much, I think, that it shrouds in negativity the future of our industry, but rather says like, even if you have the tech, there's so many other things that you need to get right. You need to sort of honestly get a friendly regulatory landscape so that you can build it. You need to get the right partners. Like the fiat on and off ramps is still a headache for everyone, not only for cross-border payments, but just for crypto in general. The onboarding, I think from a wallet perspective, that is something I think we're very proud about with, for example, ZK login, giving people the ability to log in to their wallet using traditional credentials. That already removes a lot of the hurdles of like, what are my private keys? Sponsored transaction, which is the ability for third parties to pay your gas fees. And so you don't need to worry about, I need to pay like 0.035 SUI to send a transfer, things like that. Those are steps in the right direction. And we're very proud of that, but we need to sort of keep surmounting those hurdles in order to deliver even on very basic things that are huge markets and supremely important, but still very big challenges.
Maybe as we are wrapping up, SWI has kind of the benefit in hindsight to see what has worked and what has not worked in some of these earlier networks, Bitcoin, Ethereum, Solana. What are some things that you either want to see brought over or things that you want to have kind of learned from these earlier networks that you can kind of integrate, steal to help kind of slingshot the team or Mysten to faster adoption, so to speak? Because I think you should learn from the people that have kind of walked path before you. Making the same mistakes obviously is not good. And I do think there's a lot to be learned, just as you guys are coming onto the scene, building that community, building and getting engineers, the applications, everything stood up and starting to scale.
Yeah, 100%. I think two things come to mind. One is, I think this is one thing we've actually done pretty well relative to other chains is it was always very clear to us that user experience was the most important thing. And there's different layers of user experience. One is in terms of, if your chain is not high throughput, it doesn't have, low latency, it doesn't have a good user experience, right? I don't want to be sitting on my wallet having to wait like 3 hours for a transaction to go through. I don't want to pay $100 for a transaction. So that is in itself user experience. I think that's something we learned and we've done very well. There are the other things we were talking about, like ZK login, sponsored transactions. So in general, I think everything that Mysten, SWI, Foundation, and the broader developer ecosystem is doing is really trying to figure out how do we leverage this cool infra to provide the best user experience. I think we're doing a good job there. There's a lot more to do. The other part, which I think is a very important thing for us to remember, is one thing that the very early crypto communities have been able to do successfully is build their community. And I think that's something that's important. In crypto communities are not perfect. Obviously, like we're all aware of like the bad stuff that happens on crypto Twitter and Telegram and Discord or whatever. And some things get out of line. But I think for the majority of folks in this community, maybe they're passive and they don't say much, but they feel a sense of belonging. And that's important because ultimately we're talking about digital assets. And so it is very much about digital online communities. And that is important not only because it's a little bit of the spirit and the ethos behind these these chains and this infrastructure, but it also delivers, I think, the seeds to have those crazy developers who kind of like, they go to Sui not because like, oh, I read the Mysten paper and I like it, sub-second finality. It's more like, this is a cool community. Someone build this cool project. I want to sort of figure out how to build our own. And so I think that is something where Sui honestly is very early. There is an important community. There's a lot more work to be done. I think that's something from like the very old communities, especially like Bitcoin and Ethereum, have really been able to harness in the right way. They're not perfect, but there's definitely something to learn there, in my opinion.
I think it's well put. Maybe last question, or the last question, slight curveball. I'm very excited about the Sui community, what you guys are ultimately building. I've talked as an investor with lots of different teams building there.
Right.
Some of the pros and cons that I've heard is talking about the Mysten Labs team building kind of deep book, not in-house, so to speak, kind of allowing teams to tap into that instead of kind of a crypto native team emerging. I think there's a case to be made for each side. On this Mysten side, I really appreciate, in my mind, it's kind of taking the Apple approach of integrating more components, allowing engineers to focus more and more on their applications. And the flip side, it's the community feels like Mysten Labs or Sui is ultimately competing with them. And obviously, you guys are great engineers, world-class, previously been at Meta or Facebook, and they feel like it's a little bit of competitive attention. How would you kind of address some of that feedback or talk to the community about kind of that balance?
Yeah, I would say the reality is like a lot of what Mysten and the Sui Foundation do is because they were probably the ones that know our technology best. And sometimes when innovations came out, it's hard for people to grasp them unless they can see a proof of concept. I think most of the time, the goal is not to monetize things and sort of to build first party projects, but rather to show what you can do and then have others create crazy things. So, for example, ZK Login, when it first came out, was very innovative. The Sui wallet integrated it initially as the first mover because, or else who was going to use ZK login? And then the other wallets realized, oh my God, it's really cool. Like you can just, log in with your Google credentials or Twitch credentials or whatever. And now the wallets have it, like some DeFi protocols have it and other people have built it. The goal very much is not at all for us to be the owner of these kind of things where it's just sort of really showcasing that and having other people build it. So I think that's where sort of the line is drawn. But luckily there are many other cases in which actually the communities are sort of taking the flag and building on this innovation way more than we are. To give you another example, one thing that Sui has is that you can actually store data on chain. So if you buy like a PFP NFT, you actually have the image on chain. But more important than that is that NFTs on Sui are dynamic, which means they can evolve, they can change over time. So one simple example of this is an NFT that's an image, but that changes over time, right? So for example, there's an amazing team called Studio Mirai, who I think are not only forefront of Sui, but they're the forefront of crypto in terms of what they're trying to do, because they basically issued an amazing NFT collection called Prime Matchin. And they're initially, these PFPs were in black and white. And then as, there's an upgrade to these in which you can color them, and you can color them in different ways. And so this is something very rich in which, like, we're not building NFTs at Mysten Labs like they are, but they've really showcased, like, wow, not only you can actually own your data, your PFP, you can color it and change it in ways. When you think about gaming, of having, you have your avatar and you want to equip a sword or a hat or a cape or whatever, like that is also an image can be stored on chain. That is also a dynamic NFT. And there are much more boring applications of this. For example, think about, again, international trade. There's these things called letters of credit in which like suppliers need to say like, JP Morgan, give me financing or whatever. These are boring PDFs, but they need to change a lot every time they go to a port, someone needs to sign. It could be a PDF that's an NFT that also dynamically changes as more text gets tagged onto it. So I think there is a fine line. I think that's a fair point that you're making. But at the same time, I think that for the most part, it's really just trying to show to the world, this is what you can do on Sui. Once we've made that case, it's like, it's go build on it and create something crazy.
Personally, I'm all for the free markets. People should be competitive, and if someone can outship you, you shouldn't win.
That's right.
Yeah. But awesome. Alonso, anything as we're kind of wrapping up the podcast, anything that we didn't touch upon that you wanted to touch upon, whether Sui, Mysten side, DeFi?
I would just say, first of all, it was great chatting with you. I think we've been here for 15 minutes and it went by really quickly. I would just say, like, people find any of what we've talked about exciting, go check Sui out. There's a lot of interesting things. There's a lot of wallets and DeFi protocols. I think you're starting to see a lot of traction. For example, the Electric Capital developer report came out, I believe, last week, and they showed that the biggest Move community is now in Sui. That means that the Sui community is getting a lot of traction from a developers' perspective all over the world. So if you're into trying like new languages and new protocols, go check Sui out, and I hope you like it.
Yeah, I'm of the proponent that Move will probably be the most predominant programming language for Web3 in the next 5 years, which is my prediction. But
I hope your prediction comes true.
Awesome. Well, Thank you again for coming on the podcast. Fantastic conversation. Appreciate you diving into your background, what you've been doing at Mysten, tokenomics, and also DeFi. It's early. I think people are trying to put the pieces together, and hopefully this gives them a lot of clarity.
Absolutely. It was great to be here. Thank you so much.